There we go. So this project is our Cape Ann EPA resilience effort, and there we go. So we have a team. The town green went and received technical assistance from EPA and their building blocks for regional resilience project. And this is the team that we are working with. Greg Federspiel from Manchester, Valerie Nelson from the Gloucester City Council, Dag Prouty from Town Green, and from EPA we have Genevieve Dabrowski, Abby Hall, and Cheryl Rosner. And in addition to myself, Ellie Baker is also from Horsley-Whitten. Our facilitators, which you'll meet later, are also from our Horsley-Whitten team. So to explain that the technical assistance that Town Green has received from EPA, I'm just going to pass it briefly over to Genevieve to give an introduction to that process.
Sure, thanks, Krista. Welcome, everybody. Glad to have you here today. So basically, the Building Blocks for Regional Resilience program is based on a toolkit that we offer at the EPA. It's called the Regional Resilience Toolkit, and basically it's open source. Anybody in any community can look at it and look through it and use those steps to assist their community in regional resilience planning. So I'll put a link to that in the chat if anyone's interested in looking at that. But basically today we're bringing everyone together in the Cape Ann region to talk about how to prioritize resilience planning for the region, and what those priorities are. How do we figure out which assets we want to protect as a region, and develop resilience strategies and funding plans. So that's basically the summary of the program. If anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and otherwise back to you, Krista.
Thank you, Genevieve. So for this effort on Cape Ann, our objectives are to sort of look at new approaches to build resilience to climate threats and storms, including thinking about collaboration between the communities to address common goals and threats. So looking at partnerships between the different municipalities. And through that, we hope to identify projects or efforts that, if you can't do it as an individual community, maybe there are opportunities to partner together. So when we're going to identify projects on the ground and look for funding opportunities, and then sort of develop a path to implement them down the road. There are two other efforts that Town Green is supporting, which we'll also hear about today. So it's called Typologies of Vulnerability and Voices by Climate Action. And to sort of achieve these objectives, we've got two workshops we have today, and we're going to talk about vulnerabilities and sort of think about, making sure that we're sort of on common ground about what those vulnerabilities are. And then this next workshop, which will happen on May 23rd, is start thinking about the on-the-ground projects and work on how do we develop that path and work towards implementation. So for today, we have these two outcomes that we're looking for. So we are hoping that you all participating today will gain a broader perspective on climate threats and vulnerabilities on Cape Ann. And this will either confirm the existing work that's already been happening, or maybe it's going to add to that knowledge. And we're also looking for you information that you'll need to help make decisions planning for these vulnerabilities, either in the short term or long term. So that's where our what we hope to get out of today, and this will lead us into the next workshop to talk about actions. So just our agenda for this morning, it's fairly packed, so hopefully we can be very efficient with our time. So we're going to start with some background information, sort of recap of the recent and ongoing work that's been happening in the different municipalities, a lot of planning and projects that have been happening, and then sort of just remind us on resilient Massachusetts climate projections and sort of kind of get up, a refresher on that. We're going to have short presentations on two parallel projects, the typologies of vulnerability and voices for climate action. And then we're going to get into small groups and we're going to talk about these different perspectives of vulnerabilities. We'll do a report out, and then we're going to talk as a larger group together to sort of think about, are we on the right track? Do we have any questions? What information might we need? You all, when I say we, I mean us collectively here today. And then we'll sort of talk about to prepare for May 23rd. So I'm gonna, so to start, I want to, it was important that we recognize that a lot of planning investments that have been happening already to address resilience in the different communities. So we didn't want to replicate what has been done already. We wanted to build on those efforts going forward. So these are just some of the plans that that we looked at to get us familiar with what priorities have been, what threats have been identified, and to take that. And this is not all of them. We know that there continues to be efforts that are happening. But we did find some common priorities. So obviously roadway and flooding infrastructure, transportation needs from a larger perspective, emergency and planning evacuation, emergency and evacuation planning, water resource infrastructure and resource management. So natural resource restoration, water and wastewater infrastructure, a priority for making it more resilient to climate and impacts. Natural resource management, so like I said, natural resource protection, and also public education and communication, and this would include emergency communication during events. So these were sort of the common broad that a lot of the communities on Cape Ann that have in those documents that we saw. So now I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Ellie, and she's going to sort of give us an overview on the climate projections that are for the region.
Thank you, Krista. So as many of you are likely aware, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts enlisted the help of UMass scientists to develop a set of climate model simulations to provide Massachusetts communities with the tools to plan for climate change impacts in the 21st century. These simulations address changes in precipitation patterns, temperature, sea level rise, in Massachusetts based on varying carbon emission scenarios. And these projections have been compiled by the state in a 2018 report that's available on the state's Resilience Hub website, which is resilientma.org. And many of you are probably familiar with these. You've probably explored these projections in your MVP processes and other resilience efforts. Additional data is continually being developed to help us understand the potential climate changes that can be expected in our region. But this compilation of projections put out by the state continues to provide a useful overview for planning purposes. So I'm going to present this information to you today quickly as sort of a primer for our discussions. Next slide, please. So the first topic here is sea level rise. Cape Ann is projected to see sea levels rise by 1.4 to 3.1 feet by mid-century, by 2050. And these projections are over a baseline of the year 2000, or more technically, a 19-year tidal epoch centered on the year 2000. So by 2100, sea levels are projected to rise 4 to perhaps as much as 10 feet, although this latter estimation is considered to be high. In addition, we can expect to see an increase in the intensity of storm events, and energy in the atmosphere, and the ability of storms to gather more energy from a warmer southern ocean. While it's not clear that we'll experience more frequent hurricanes, we can expect that the hurricanes that we do experience will be stronger and more damaging, and we'll hear a little bit about that today. Next slide, please. So with regard to precipitation and rainfall, we can expect years overall in the future, with an increase of up to 5.5 inches in annual precipitation by mid-century, and maybe as much as 7 inches in annual precipitation by the end of the century. So for comparison, we currently receive about 44 inches of precipitation annually. So this is a pretty significant increase. This increase is likely to occur more in the winter than the spring and summer, which potentially resulting in rain on snow events, which can be troubling, and a lack of snow in general. In addition, as shown on the right on this slide, we can expect a significant increase in the amount of rain that is delivered in very heavy rainfall events. So the two top maps show that this change is already being observed in the Northeast. From 1958 to 2016, for example, we've seen a 55% increase in the total annual precipitation that falls in the heaviest 1% of events. So that just means we are seeing wetter rainfall events. Conversely, we can expect a slight increase in consecutive dry days, which when combined with hotter temperatures can create concern for water supplies. So in short, in summary, we can expect wetter winters, heavier storms, and more very wet and very dry spells. Next slide, please. And finally, we can expect an increase in the annual average temperature in our region from 3 to 6 degrees by mid-century and 4 to 10 degrees by the end of century. This is the annual average temperature over the year, but notably we're projected to experience hotter summers with many more days above 90 degrees and hotter winters with many fewer days below freezing. So this puts a strain on our energy supplies for cooling and air conditioning needs, and it also alters our ecology as we begin to lose the summer and winter processes that our ecosystems depend on. So you're probably familiar with a lot of these numbers, and I apologize for throwing a lot of numbers at you, but hopefully this gives you a little bit of a baseline for our discussions and our understanding as we move forward. So with that, I'll pass it back to Krista.
Thank you, Ellie. Let's take a poll. So we're going to launch a poll. I think we're interested in your opinion. This is not for decision making. We just want to get a feel for the temperature in the room about what you think are the priorities, the most important vulnerabilities related to climate change on Cape Ann. What should the communities be focusing on? And we'd like you to pick your top 3. So it could be roadways, emergency communication and response, water and sewer infrastructure, coastal erosion, loss of wetlands or other habitat, property damage, power, impacts to the local economy, impacts to the local culture or community connection, climate justice, thinking about, are there segments of the population that are more susceptible or bear the brunt more of climate impacts. And if something is not listed here that you feel should be, please put it in the chat. I'll just give folks. Starting to slow down with responses. And there, and I think we're trying to understand where everyone is at. We have a very diverse group with us this morning. We have some residents, municipal staff, people who sit on municipal boards and committees. So a lot of different perspectives. So I think this will help us understand who's with us today. I think we're slowing down. All right, why don't we end the poll, Natasha, and let's see what our results are. So it looks like about half of you all, water and sewer infrastructure is a priority, followed by, let's see, coastal erosion, about 45%. And looks like we have a tie between roadways and the power grid. So those were the top. So let's, and then not close behind, habitat, loss of wetlands and habitat, property damage. So not such a high priority, local culture and community connection. or local business in the economy or climate justice. So thank you for that. So let's keep that in mind as we move on for the rest of the morning. So with that, I'd like to turn over to Kira Clingen. She is with the Harvard Graduate School of Design, and she's going to share with us their work that they're doing with Town Green on Cape Ann.
Thank you, Krista. Okay, I'll share my screen. This is the hardest part. All right, can everyone see a storm hitting Dog Bar? Perfect, okay. So good morning, everyone. Like Krista said, my name is Kira Clingen, and I'm a research associate at the Office for Urbanization, which is a design research group at the Harvard University Graduate School of Design. And the Office for Urbanization is a design research office that's led by Professor Charles Waldheim. The office addresses societal and cultural issues that are associated with architecture, urbanism, and planning. And we study these issues through a technique called scenario planning, where we work through sponsored design research projects. And the work that I'll share today on extreme weather events are part of a year-long project with the generous support of the Cape Ann Climate Coalition, as well as the Gloucester Meeting House Foundation, Manchester by the Sea, and the City of Gloucester. And in this project, we're trying to understand exactly what Ellie just shared, kind of the ways that climate change is already changing Cape Ann, and how climate change will continue to change the Cape. And so at the office, we use what's called scenario planning to help stakeholders imagine different futures. So scenario planning is a method of long-term strategic planning, and it essentially creates different representations, so different visions or different images of multiple plausible different futures that we can use to inform our decision-making in the present. So that's almost like a stress test to kind of understand what's important. And scenario planning doesn't produce scientific models or probabilistic models. We've already seen today how much excellent data there is, and so we use that data in our work to create these scenarios that frame new ways of thinking about the future. And so before I share this work, I really want to emphasize that the goal of scenario planning is not to predict exactly what will happen in the future. Instead, it's to reveal the biases and blind spots that we all bring to these complex situations from our own experiences and expertise. And it's a really great tool for climate change in that way, which is happening on such a long time horizon and is also beyond the control of any single individual or entity, which is why it's so important that so many different stakeholders are in the room today. And so the year-long exercise that we're working at includes 2 scenarios and 2 studies. And the first scenario is what I'll share really briefly in a few moments. It's titled The Great Storm of 2038, a callback to the hurricane in 1938. And it evaluates a moderate hurricane, a Category 3 hurricane that essentially shows the potential costs if we do nothing. And then we'll move into scenario 1, where we'll actually look at ideas for how to adapt the Cape to climate change, including hard and soft infrastructures and ways to think about relocation. And then we have 2 studies that we'll be able to share toward the end of the summer, which look at net zero housing on Cape Ann that's affordable to a large range of residents, and then also looking at recovering waste for energy projection. And so today I'll be sharing a few images of our draft work on Scenario 0, the Great Storm of 2038. And again, this work will just add the perspective of an extreme weather event to the sea level projections and temperature projections that Ellie just shared. And so the Great Storm of 2038 is named after the hurricane of 1938, which devastated New England almost a century ago. And the way that we're choosing to visualize the storm is through different media. So we have rendered images and animations that we'll walk through. And the idea is that by seeing these kind of scenarios of the future, you can immerse yourself in what a plausible, but again, not probable, this isn't a prediction, image of what Cape Ann might look like during a hurricane. And so the idea here is that we're just going to support everyone with additional information to help make decisions in the present. And so the Great Storm of 2038 takes place in almost a decade, or in about a decade from now, after the rainiest summer in 2 decades. The storm forms off the coast of Cape Verde, off the west coast of Africa in mid-August during peak hurricane season, as we all know. and travels across the Atlantic, turning into a Category 3 storm as it skirts the Bahamas. By 3 a.m. on September 2nd, which is the Thursday before Labor Day weekend, scientists and residents are all bracing for the storm, and tourists who have come up to the Cape for the last long weekend are taking shelter as well. Meteorologists all raise the alarm that the storm will make landfall during an astronomical high tide, and it will travel through western Massachusetts, which sends the largest waves directly up to the south, which, as we all know, is right into Gloucester's inner harbor. And the storm overwhelms the inner harbor in Gloucester. This is a planimetric view. We have the State Fish Pier right here, and it overwhelms the working waterfront. Ships fly off their moorings, and the Good Harbor Marsh, which we can see in the background here, floods from the back into downtown. The high winds cause massive damages throughout the inner harbor. In Rockport, the storm overwhelms Bearskin Neck. Right here, this is a motif number 1 for orientation, flooding the entire neck as well as Front Street. And the maximum waves on all of these slides, we have a little bit of information about what this storm might look like. And so in this case in Rockport, the storm surges over 18 feet, and there's also significant amounts of rainfall. In Manchester, the town hall, which is located right here, as well as the wastewater treatment plant, which is in here, are overwhelmed by water. The town's emergency operations center has to be relocated after the generator floods in the town hall, and the MBTA bridge is overtopped early in the storm, which can take up to 2 years to fully repair if the state can afford to do so. Canoma Point in Essex is almost totally inundated. Canoma Point Road, which leads out to the point, has been stressed by saltwater for years, which makes it easier for it to buckle during the storm. And now I'll share kind of a couple of images that hopefully put you into the storm itself in areas that you know or recognize along the Cape. Here we have the Cut Bridge, where early during the storm, cars start to evacuate. When power goes out, the drawbridge is stuck in the down position, and so residents continue to evacuate, but there's still a line of traffic down Stacy Boulevard, which, as we talked about, is where the highest waves are coming up from the south. When the hurricane intensifies and arrives over the astronomical high tide in the early afternoon, the waves rage over and collapse the Cut Bridge, as well as portions of Stacy Boulevard, which are built on infilled land. The houses behind the bridge on Perkins Road and Centennial Avenue, shown back here, are damaged by the high winds, which rip off roofs and down trees. The Stop and Shop, we talked in the poll about natural systems and marshland. The Stop and Shop is built on fill in Good Harbor Marsh, and it's the site of shopping early in the morning of the storm. But during the storm, the marsh floods, and the berm that supports the building in the marsh starts to erode. The morning after the storm, residents have to seek emergency supplies for the weeks ahead. Grocery stores do not have power, and their shelves are empty or damaged by water. The Stop and Shop building starts to sink into its foundation, just like the other buildings across Cape Ann that are built into salt marshes. Residents lining up for gas before the storm, including in Manchester by the Sea, caused traffic jams in congested downtown centers, where traffic backs up onto Route 127, which is a critical evacuation route through downtown Manchester. During the storm, floodwaters spill over sandbags and flood the businesses downtown. The flooding cuts pump lines at gas stations, but petroleum, as well as chemicals and other storage tanks across the Cape, leak out. Contaminated floodwaters pour out toward the ocean, as well as shell fishing grounds from gas stations and the Gloucester and Manchester wastewater treatment plants, both of which are located in the flood zone. The morning after the storm, residents smell leaking petroleum throughout downtown Manchester, and people line up with gas cans to spark generators. In the weeks after the storm, there are increased public health risks due to carbon monoxide poisoning from generators, as well as residents inhaling mold as floodwaters recede. At Long Beach, tourists evacuate ahead of Labor Day weekend. The seawall, which is classified as a dam because water flows back through the marsh onto the beach, prevents the water levels in the marsh behind the beach from lowering. During the storm, the cottages are battered from both the marsh and ocean sides by pretty high waves. The high tide overtops the seawall, and debris crashes into the homes along the beach. The morning after the storm, the seawall and the road are demolished, as well as many of the cottages, where flooding and mold are major problems in the weeks to come. And this damage isn't limited to Long Beach, it's also other coastal residents in low-lying neighborhoods. The Essex Causeway floods in Essex, floods early in the morning of the storm, which cuts off Route 133, which is another critical evacuation route. Traffic causes issues for residents trying to evacuate across Apple Street, which is located further back in Essex, but also has minor flooding. During the storm, the Essex Causeway experiences major flooding, and the Great Marsh erodes due to all of these structures that are built into the marsh. In the aftermath of the storm, Cape Ann does not have power for 2 weeks. Over 15,000 homes are flooded, and major evacuation routes, including the Causeway, remain impassable. The bridge is washed out, and the stormwater system under many roads are leaking waste. Residents seeking emergency medical attention must turn around and look for alternate routes around downed trees to get to Addison Gilbert Hospital. The estimated damages from the hurricane are over $650 million, which is greater than the damages of all previous hurricanes on Cape Ann combined, due to what Ellie was talking about earlier of hurricanes increasing and intensifying. And so again, I know that's a little bit alarming, but these images are not supposed to be a probable picture of the future in Cape Ann. They're simply a plausible vision of some of the impacts that a Category 3 storm might have on the ground in Cape Ann in places that are already changing. And again, this work is just the beginning of our year-long study. And as we move to look at adaptations, strategies, as well as net zero housing. And so in closing, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Kira. I know there are a few questions in the chat, and I will just note that Kira and her colleagues are doing a presentation of their more in-depth that's focused on their work in May. And there any questions, we can they could take at that time. I think we want to focus on our work today and with the EPA's and Cape Ann's project, but keep an eye out for Kira's work coming up in that presentation. And with that, our other project that's also going, the other project that's also being parallel to this is the Voices for Climate Action. And I would like to ask, if Dick Prouty would introduce that and the folks that are working on that effort, just to give a highlight of where they are at this time.
Good morning, everybody. Yes, we're doing an engagement project that has two pieces. First piece is an ethnographic study by Professor Doherty of the Harvard Graduate School of Design, and he's had two postdocs living here starting a month and a half ago, and we'll have another month and a half to go. And they're going to introduce themselves and speak briefly about their work, process and outcome. And then I've asked Susie Natty to give an on-the-ground description of the second piece of it, which is interviewers in each of the 4 Cape Ann towns and communities, which are taking a first and second interview with 5 or more people each. We expect to have 80 to 100 people interviewed by mid-May, and then we're going to have those transcribed and studied and look for themes that will begin to inform our second process, into our second workshop in May 23rd. So I'd like to have the 2 interviewers begin now and introduce themselves.
Sure, who would go first?
No, that's Professor Doherty's 2 groups. Okay. And yes. I'm not going to introduce their names because I'm afraid I'll mispronounce them.
So,
does everyone see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, so good morning and thank you for having us this morning. I'm Ayaka.
My name is Sohan.
Today we will present Cape Ann fieldwork, which purpose is to understand the residents' perception about the area's present condition and its future, especially concerning climate change. So we are the research associates from Harvard Graduate School of Design, Critical Landscape Design Lab, led by Professor Gareth Doherty. We are the group of designers focused on people-centered landscape architecture. For this research, we collaborate with CAPAN team and an Office for Urbanization. We moved to Gloucester in February 1st, 2022, and lived in Gloucester downtown for 3 months. CAPAN fieldwork consists of landscape fieldwork, interviews, and cognitive mapmaking workshop. By walking, biking, using public transportations, and riding in residence cars, we explore the CAPAN landscapes and observed local lives. We also participated and then engaged in various community activities while conversing with residents. Immersive and flat is an important quality of landscape fieldwork. Flat means we met various groups regardless of their positions in the society, from the vulnerable populations to decision makers. We interviewed 40 CAPAN residents from various groups and interact with around 100 people throughout the research. All our interactions and observations were recorded in our field notes. Every hour we spent in a field, we spent 4 hours of interpreting. We write, draw, measure, organize, and interpret our daily immersive experiences. Collective fieldwork was also the important key for this research. 2 researchers on site could give us an opportunity to check each other's prejudice and reflect on each other. So from here, we will introduce various attitudes and thoughts of residents towards the climate change that we analyzed so far based on our fieldwork. So first, some residents describe that climate change is a certain thing that they can observe in some events, such as sea level rise, storm, and floods. So convinced is a state of accepting information or fact regardless of one's preferences.
And some are more anxious. It's a state of mind which fears losing certainty. They worry about losing existing landscapes such as beaches and marshes that eventually impact both human life and habitats of many species. Others also show their concern about they might be trapped in the island, as the map shows. Many residents describe the Cape Ann as an island which connected to the outside by a bridge. People worries that what if the bridge washes out? When we asked residents if they think the climate in Cape Ann is changing, many expressed uncertainty. Weather is perceived as everyday events, whereas climate change is perceived as a global phenomenon. Some did not feel confident to make a claim on climate change based on their subjective experiences because they were aware of the gap between weather and climate. Also, residents who spend most of their time indoors, climate was outside of their radar. Some residents understood climate change as a scientific fact, but was hesitant to accept it for various reasons. In case of a fisherman, climate change mitigation was the reason why many regulations were introduced, but he could not see the impacts of these regulations. Because of the regulatory association with climate change agenda, one fisherman expressed hesitant to accept climate change. Lastly, some people accept climate change as a scientific fact, but not as a problem of their own. Some residents express lack of interest on the climate change issue because they are content with the current status of their world and separated the issue from their world, making it as a problem for the next generation or someone else. So today we introduce Cape Ann residents' various perceptions towards climate change based on our fieldwork. We hope understanding the diverse voices in the area can contribute to inclusive decision-making process for adapting and mitigating, also communicating climate change impacts. Thank you.
and Dick, you had another, Susanna.
Yes, thank you so much. You know, Susie Natty is going to give a on-the-ground perspective of the individual interview process.
Great, thank you. Hi, everybody. So I interviewed a cohort that was elders and interviewed people ranging from their late 60s to their early 90s. In both interviews 1 and 2, there was a definite learning curve for me. I'm not a professional interviewer. And in practice, I think it would have been good for me to have had a practice session with somebody before I launched into interview, the first interview for both those sets. However, I can add that interview 1 was more challenging than interview number 2. The questions about what people valued about Cape Ann was open-ended enough that it seemed to be difficult for some of them to get a toehold in what I was trying to get at. Although there were people who tend to be more self-reflective than others anyway, and some of these issues were closer to the tops of their minds. But pretty much universally, the level of concern I got from this first interview about climate change impacts was almost nil, or at least not brought up as a concern. In interview number 2, that was a different story. The interview functioned as much as an educational tool as an interview soliciting responses. People were quite impressed with the potential impacts, and as a consciousness raising tool was very effective. That's it.
Right, and we use some of the same graphics that you saw from Kira Clingen.
That's right.
Interview number 2, and interview number 1 was just talking about values of why they love to live on Cape Ann. And we're going to be connecting these 2 dots in a report later on. Thank you so much, Susie.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And just, you know, when we meet again on the 23rd, we'll check back in and see the progress that has been made, additional report outs from that. We'll be looking forward to that. Well, thank you both, all of you. We really appreciate that. So I'm gonna my screen sharing. So now we're gonna, you know, you've heard a lot from a lot of other folks. You've been listening. So now it's your turn to talk and give your feedback. So we're gonna break up into small groups, and we're interested in your thoughts and reactions to these to these presentations and to this work. And, you know, does it expose new vulnerabilities? Are we, those that we've thought were vulnerable, are they still vulnerable? Like I said, do we need to identify new ones, things that we haven't considered that were vulnerable? And what are the impacts to these vulnerabilities in the short term and the long term? Do we think about climate change plus this great storm? So just sort of thinking more broadly. And we're going to probably take about 40 minutes to talk through these. Oh, I apologize. And we'll have a little bit of ground rules. So like I said, we have a diverse group with us today. So we want to make sure that we respect different perspectives of those in the room. Let's be open to new ideas and to think outside of the box. Since the groups might be a little large, you know, make sure you raise your hand, the feature in Zoom, you know, use the chat. Your facilitator will also be taking notes, so please be patient with them as they do that. If they need to ask you to repeat something, just recognize that they're also doing that as well. And with that, I think, are there any sort of initial questions before we break out? And we will come back and do a report out as well. So if you wanted to, you know, just about the small groups and what we'll be doing in there. Don't see any questions. Great. So can I post it? So I see in the chat, can you post the questions? Your facilitator is going to help you out. So you'll be able to do that. And yes, the groups are randomly So you'll be put in a room randomly. Great questions. All right, let's take some time and have some discussion. I think we're ready to go. So I hope everyone had some meaningful conversations. Hope you learned something. That's always a plus. I always get that.
Hi, we have to, unfortunately, Eileen and I have to drop out, but this was quite a rewarding experience. Thank you. And we look forward to staying in touch with everyone here.
Great, thank
you.
It was
terrific.
Great job.
Terrific. Thank you.
Great. We have your email. We'll let you know when the next meeting that is starting to register for that. So we'll be in touch. Thank you.
Good. Thank you. Thank you.
Excellent.
All right. So let's hear what folks discussed in their groups. And I asked our facilitators if you've designated someone in your group, great. If not, just asking our facilitators to report out and just give some highlights. What were some of the initial reactions or sort of thoughts about the presentations, and if there were any new vulnerabilities or just confirmed ones that you already knew on the Cape related to if it were people, places, infrastructure, did it just confirm them, and just kind of what major themes came out of your group. So I am going to start with Gabby.
Okay, thanks, Krista. I was just jumping between screens. So we had a great discussion in our group. A lot of different thoughts in terms of reactions to the presentations and the Great Storm scenario. I think, folks said that there were not necessarily, new vulnerabilities maybe being identified, but there were some powerful visuals in there. One person noticed interesting to think about scenario planning with a major event is kind of like when we plan for parking in a shopping center for Black Friday, we plan for some of the more extreme situations. So it can be valuable to get people's attention. Folks also noted that one piece that seemed to be missing from some of the identified impacts from the presentations was impacts for small businesses, and that could be a potential major impact for some of these smaller communities that really rely on those for the tax base. We also talked a little bit about some interest in learning more about what the decision making will be for evacuating, because these visuals from the Great Storm scenario in particular seem to emphasize that evacuation is really going to be a big component of planning for the future. Also brought up some concerns about impacts on barrier beaches from some of these extreme storms. We talked a lot about how these scenarios might maybe invite some people into the table for a conversation about climate change, and it might also turn others off. So we talked a lot about trying to have some different communication strategies for different audiences. So folks who are maybe more hesitant about climate change, they might be, kind of shut down based on some of the scenario planning that we saw, but others might be more interested and would feel like this is a good starting part for a conversation. So kind of a need to have some different communications with different audiences. Another piece that came up was around transportation. So since evacuation seems like it's going to be a big piece, having some really good communication around planning transportation is going to be important as well. And in terms of vulnerabilities, in terms of vulnerable groups and people, we talked about people who don't have access to cars and maybe don't have the time to pay attention to some of these conversations about climate change. Those people need to be prioritized. We could do a better job of making these connections with some of these different audiences. So some of this outreach is already happening. We heard about some efforts in Gloucester to work with folks through churches, high school, seniors, but it's challenging because it takes a lot of time and energy to meet people where they are. And then we also kind of just, I'd say, rounded out things by having a conversation about other tools we're seeing in different communities that might be helpful for Cape Ann. So we talked a little bit about Plum Island, how they had that beyond this point, there's no evacuation sign. Other really powerful visuals like that might pull folks in. We talked about a need for state leadership, and that's something that's going to be critical. So it's great to have these conversations happening at a smaller scale in individual communities, but we really need a strong regional effort. And then in addition to that, we also need really strong support at the state level as well to plan for some of these impacts. I think those were the biggest highlights from the conversation.
Great, thank you so much, Ellie, or Gabby, and your group. I'm gonna now pick on Lori.
Thank you. We had a great conversation. In terms of general reactions to the presentations, universally, everybody really appreciated the presentations. In particular, the visualizations were very effective in kind of helping people to understand kind of how this sort of broader climate data actually manifests in real life, could manifest in real life. One of the comments was one of the participants had a visceral reaction, kind of it went from his head to his gut, and I totally related to that. And really great to hear the perspectives that came out of the interviews, and a lot of appreciation for the boots on the ground and the people there doing the interviews and really gathering these perspectives, and also emphasizing the importance of inclusive decision making, and that's an important aspiration, and it's really important to all work together across municipalities and understand the interconnectedness. And so a lot of great reactions to those presentations. In terms of new vulnerabilities or kind of changing perspectives on vulnerabilities, there was emphasis on importance of understanding vulnerability at the neighborhood level and also planning around neighborhood scale response and communication. And an example was from Detroit neighborhoods, where there's neighborhood kind of coalitions to respond to emergencies. And that might be an important tool going forward in action planning. A lot of concern about infrastructure, and especially emphasizing the infrastructure that goes across municipal boundaries and interdependencies for wastewater treatment, water supply, sewage, drinking water, evacuation routes. There were a couple particular spots like Thatcher Road and Grant Circle that were mentioned. But beyond infrastructure, also looking at vulnerable populations, particularly elderly populations, and thinking about young people and making sure that we're keeping in mind mental health. And while these presentations can be very dramatic and disturbing, it's important to also provide comfort and reassurance that planning is happening and that it's not all going to be on the shoulders of young people to take this burden. And as a parent, that resonated with me for sure. Let's see, also thinking about natural systems and the ability of salt marshes to buffer some of the storm energy. And lastly, just around communications, thinking about, while we're looking at the Great Storm scenario out to 2038, also recognizing that these impacts could happen next year, and that the communities are already vulnerable. It could be next year, it could be the next 5 years. It may not be a hurricane, but it may be a nor'easter. So really emphasizing the urgency in moving forward with protecting these vulnerable assets and populations.
Thank you so much, Lori, and thank you to your group. Ellie.
Sure. We had a lot of the same themes that we've heard already, which is good. There's some common thoughts there. I guess in our first reaction, what we heard from folks is similar to what Lori just expressed, which people were very appreciative of the information. They thought the visuals were really impactful and easy to kind of relate to and awe-inspiring a little bit. I also heard that it would be nice when data about climate change is presented, that if it includes a little bit more about sort of the ecological impacts, impacts on human public health, that kind of side of things, that we don't just talk about data, but let's talk about sort of the impacts little bit more. So we talked a lot about how there are traumatic consequences to all of this. And so the impacts to, public health and vulnerable populations is important. And we really need to think about that side of all of this and not just talk about sort of infrastructure issues and property issues, but really talk about the human side of all of this. We also talked about neighborhoods. So that sounds like it was a thread in some of the other communities, but we talked about the importance of planning for emergencies. And one way to really plan for emergencies is to strengthen neighborhood networks. And in doing that, also reach out to vulnerable populations and make sure that those communities are also strengthened and able to be resilient and plan for climate change and these more dramatic events. We also heard a bit about sort of the importance of the idea that the data or the projections that we're seeing and that we're presenting may not actually take into account, they don't take into account all of what we are learning about what's happening in the Arctic. And so it's important to communicate that these projections are real, changes are happening. And how do we communicate that without overwhelming people and scaring them, but communicating in a way that's realistic so people can really understand what's happening. In terms of, well, I'll leave it at that. A lot of the themes were very similar to other discussions as well. So
Great. Thank you, Ellie, and thank you to your group. Kelly.
Sure, and I will preface it by saying thank you to my group. We had a great conversation. In terms of reactions to the presentation, some initial words that were thrown out there was that, this is based in reality and strong science. The past is a prologue for what may happen. These sorts of events are inevitable. It's so sobering, but it's also really motivating in terms of forcing us to take action. We had a lot of similar themes that have already been discussed. Some of the key ones that we talked a lot about were the importance of public education and communication, both between decision makers and within communities and neighborhoods. And two big questions that we touched upon were kind of, are there best practices or learning experiences in other communities or from other organizations that have done climate resilience public education in the past that we can apply in Cape Ann? And then again, how do we really get the community excited about the fact that we need to act? And one of the things that we talked about was that kind of the visual presentation that we saw in the presentations at the beginning were really a great tool to build into public education. We also heard about the importance of emergency planning in general and why that's also important to build into public education and get that messaging out about emergency planning and the importance of preparedness and evacuation. One key site that I haven't heard mentioned yet is the Blackburn Industrial Park. One of our meeting participants noted that there's only one access point in and out, and that is a workplace that thousands of people work at, and one accident on that access road could essentially trap people there. We also heard about the importance of planning that considers how natural features will react to extreme events. So we spoke about beaches and how they have the potential to shift and migrate, and how that will affect the infrastructure that's behind them, and also how that will affect the region's tourist economy and kind of tourism activities. And then to end, one thing that we spoke a lot about is, whether the term kind of rebuilding is the most appropriate in a post-storm landscape, especially if we're talking about a storm that is going to cause such wholesale change in the communities and environments in that post-storm landscape. And kind of how do we start preparing residents in the community for that change? Is that talking about things like managed retreat now, and how do we broach those really emotional emotional topics? And then the last thing is, obviously the 2038 Great Storm scenario is huge, but there's a need to prepare for kind of those shorter recurrence storms, and also look for other types of hazards that have occurred in the past, such as kind of like an earthquake, tsunami type event, which would also be devastating and has potential in the future. So I will leave it there.
Thank you so much, Kelly, and thank you to your group as well. Craig, you are our last group, last but not least.
Sure, going last, we obviously heard a lot of the same themes. Just initial reactions to the presentations. We kind of heard both sides in my group. Some folks thought they were great and they were really interesting and a little overwhelming. Some folks felt that they might have been a little alarmist. And that kind of led into the conversation about needing to really motivate the general public to engage in these conversations, and maybe a moderate or softer approach might be a little bit more effective. But the end result is that education and communication and coordination is really critical and important here. As far as, so other folks mentioned just the need for both short-term and long-term measures, making those incremental changes today, building towards the, a more resilient community in the future. Taking a look at that 2038 great storm, that's years off, but we could have a significant event tomorrow, and we really need to be considering that today. The need for coordination at a regional level, was expressed quite a bit, identifying those common threads, whether it's emergency communications or emergency access on the roadway network, or if it's even capacities and shared use agreements for wastewater treatment. Those really should be happening so that we can identify those common threads. The one issue with that came up was that, different communities have their different priorities based on their existing conditions and then their projected future conditions. So that makes it a little bit difficult to sort of plan, with other communities. And then also just trying to find that balance of short-term and long-term. The town of Essex mentioned that Mass DOT is replacing the Essex, the Essex River Bridge. They're actually replacing it in place, and they're not elevating it because of the existing conditions of businesses flanking both sides. And elevating would require significant ramps, which would occupy parking, which would create a whole domino effect of other issues. Eventually the bridge and the businesses may be lost. So, it's that balance of what you're doing today, and then what you're doing as far as planning for the future scenarios as well.
Thank you, Craig, and thank you to your group. And I do see a couple of comments in the chat about the link to the recording. So Town Green will be coordinating that. So be on the lookout with them for the recording of this video. And we'll follow up with some of the other comments about, let's see, there's one to us about the Plum Island report. I don't have an answer to that, but we can follow up. Also a comment about the impacts to offshore wind farms. I think these are questions that we can follow up with for the next meeting. And with that, I think before we sort of, I want to help us think about our next meeting, which we're going to talk about actions and how to approach some of these vulnerabilities. But I was interested in running our poll again, and if perhaps you might change your answers. You don't have to, it's not, but I wanted to run our poll again, and perhaps maybe you had the same priorities as you did when you came in this morning. But, if after hearing our presentations and talking within your groups, do you still consider those the most vulnerable? So we'll just give you a minute to take those. And I know we do have a smaller group than when we did when we started, so I do recognize that. But just interested, and if you, I do, and I have the results from the previous poll, so we'll do a quick comparison. Almost there, about half, about 60%. We'll give it another 30 seconds because I don't want to release you just yet. I think we came to a standstill. Oh. All right. I think we'll, I think we'll close the poll, Natasha. There we go. So let's see. So roadways, 38%. It was about 42 last time, and this earlier, first poll. Communications, 13%, now up to 38%. Water and sewer, still high at 56%. It was about 50 earlier. Coastal erosion, that was about 45 this morning, similar at 31. Loss of wetland and habitat, it's about a quarter of you. It was about 37% earlier. Property damage is 22. We were at 37% before. The power grid, about the same, and 44 versus 42. Local business economy, that is about the same. We were at 11% earlier, now we're at 13. Local culture and community connection, so that went up a little bit. We were at 5% this morning and now a little bit higher at 13. And climate justice, that is exactly the same. So thank you. It's just kind of interesting. Just, you know, just hoping that we can open up new perspectives. And so maybe we did that a little bit. I see, Edward, you have your hand raised. Yes, unmute yourself.
Yeah, one of the key points we made or talked about today, or the whole focus really was on climate change in terms of its impact from the seaward side. But this weekend, or just Friday, there was a 22-acre fire in Rockport up behind the cemetery. You can easily see it if you walk along that road that goes from 127 at Common Crow out to the cemetery or vice versa. And there's also a house fire up on Squam Road. This whole area is heavily forested, and that's a very positive thing. We don't want to lose that. But I think we ought to think about the impact too, because a lot of our houses are surrounded by forested areas, and with a dry spell and a good fire, we might find ourselves in a California situation locally. There's a lot of potential dry timber out there to go, and we shouldn't totally focus on the water. Climate change can produce all sorts of reactions.
That's a great point. Thank you for sharing that. So before we go, I would like to use sort of our last 6 minutes to think about, you know, help us prepare for the next workshop. And I am going to share my screen on this one last bit. And so when we meet again on May 23rd, so we're going to be talking about alternative actions for the Cape based on your feedback from your discussions today. But we also are looking if there is additional information that you might need to help make decisions or to understand issues. So my first question, and I would ask you, to raise your hand or type in the chat sort of answers to these questions. So what decisions do we have to make, or questions do we have to debate? I know some of them had come up in the report outs. So in order to minimize these impacts on these vulnerable people, places, infrastructure. So is there anything, other questions? Yes, Tom, I see your hand up. Yep, there you go.
So in Rockport, the Long Beach leases are a 10-year cycle, and they expire at the end of 2023. if we want to decide to do anything different with 149 cottages there, this is the time to make that decision.
Thank you. Yes, Laura.
Yes, I just wanted to comment that one thing that communities need to do is to group regionally to get the best bylaws and regulations in place that can be protective for the future. And I don't know of any efforts right now to do that on a regional basis, but I understand from a lot of communities throughout Massachusetts that this is the way to go, to work regionally like we're doing right now, to kind of come up with the best. We've all been waiting for better help from the state to improve land use issues. I'm on the Conservation Commission in Rockport, so I think about this a lot. Anyway, we could all use a lot of help. Our communities could, business as usual is going on full force.
And, you know, we can talk about that in the next, in May, and just thinking about the challenges and the opportunities related to that. So thank you for your comment. Allison.
Yeah, hi, sorry.
Okay.
So I really want to second what Laura just said about a regional forum, and I would go further and say that I think the town administrators of Gloucester, Rockport, Manchester and Essex need to have a forum in which they discuss many of these issues that are obviously common to all the towns and often require budgets that are way beyond the purview of each individual town. Some of the key things that we've talked about, like the power grid and the water resources and all the rest of it. So I hope out of this meeting can come some agreement that the people in the town governments can coordinate together to form a regional committee to discuss these issues on a regular basis.
Thank you, Allison. Edward, I see you're next. Oh, you're on. Oh, there you. Oh, you just muted yourself one more time. There you go.
You know, it's not just. I used to be on the planning board in Rockport. I was on the planning board in Wellesley, where I lived many years ago. It's not just the current situation with the climate change. It's not just under emergency situations. Each town wants to be on its own bottom. Each town wants to make its own decision, but we don't have the resources. And we have, for just regular planning, the comprehensive planning concepts, the regional planning concepts, but focusing on the community, we don't have the resources, as has just been said. So we need this on a regular basis, just for the normal activities, i.e. planning for zoning, planning for whatever, to be able to pull on resources. MAPC is fine, but the North Shore Task Force discusses issues, but it doesn't have the resources to really, for instance, if every town could pull from a pool of talented people that worked at a central location in the Cape or the North Shore, and then get a certain percentage of that resource capability applied when they have a particular need, it would be a fantastic thing, and it would help solve this problem of people, each community working on its own and in a vacuum. It would really, it would force on a daily basis conversations like we're talking about, not just once in a while we get together and talk about it. So I think that's a critical thing.
Thank you, Edward. And I will recognize that it is 11 o'clock. We did push the limits with time here. We will continue to answer questions and listen to you all. I recognize some of you may have to go with other commitments, but we will continue to work to go through your questions and your answers. So I just wanted to let folks know that that we will send out information about our May 23rd meeting. And I thank you, our guest speakers, and I thank you all for participating. Duncan, you're next on ICU. Please unmute yourself. Yes.
Yeah, this may not be the forum for this, and you may find this comment a bit heretical, But what I noticed is that there's a uniformity of ideology here. And I just wonder if the conversations, including climate deniers and including people that have other perspectives, might be welcomed in some way, because that's likely to be part of the difficulty in trying to accomplish any of this, is that there's likely to be opposition.
Right. Yeah, and I think we did hear from the communication and making sure that communication is to different groups. So that point is taken, and we'll put that on our list. Thank you. Thank you. Laura, I see your hand up again. Nope. Okay. Jerry, thank you.
I come from a for-profit business background, and when we were trying to resolve issues within our companies, we would analyze all of the issues, and there were items that fell above the cut line and things that below the cut line. And I look at all these problems that we're talking about, and I reflect on your survey. Not all of our issues are we going to have the finances to resolve. We've got to pick the most important issues to focus on, do a Pareto analysis of where we're going to get the biggest bang for our buck and focus on those. I realize that some people are going to be disappointed because their concern falls below the cut line, but you only have limited resources, and you need to focus on the most important issues that you're going to get the biggest return.
Yep, prioritization. Thank you for that comment. And I see, so Jerry was our last hand raised. Something to think about for next time. We don't have to, I recognize it's 11:03, but, are we on the, do we need or to revise our current plan in the general term? Do we need a different outlook as we prepare, particularly with relation to the great storm and that sort of scenario that was presented? And what do those changes look like? What new considerations do we need to think about? I think some of you have brought that up already in your initial comments, but something to be thinking about for May. And then just throwing this last one out there, so we can do our best to help prepare, but is there information that you might need to help you sort of understand issues better, or, understand issues or help make decisions? We will do our best to prepare that for the next meeting, but you can also type it in the chat. What would be helpful to understand better as we think about what kind of actions, if it's individual communities, if it's collaborating on a regional basis, what are some questions that you have for us to follow up with? It might be a case study. Someone mentioned best practices in the report out, anything you would like to sort of emphasize before we leave. Please feel free to do that. Jerry, I'm assuming your hand is still up from last time. So there is a comment. So Valerie's hand is up as well. Valerie, please.
Well, I just prompted after one of these last comments that Jerry made about we need to have cut lines and money is scarce, and I think there's more and more discussion about, we don't just calculate, how much it would cost to rebuild some wastewater project and have municipalities try to save the most money. I think fundamentally we're doing the Voices Project because the people in our communities are the ones who should decide what their priorities are. And so some values, for example, around natural ecosystems, may be of such importance to the voters and residents that you might spend more money on those than you can just measure in monetary value terms, as is typically done. So we're really trying to bring in the people's voices into those kinds of discussions. It's not just money, it's values and attachments and the wishes of the people for what they want in the community of the future.
Thank you, Valerie. So just a reminder about our workshop on the 23rd. We'll get an update on the Voices for Climate Action project. We'll talk about actions. So here it says strategies and policies, but really we're looking for actions, projects that we can plan for. And I think I do have the wrong date. Is it May 18th that
May 18th.
Sorry about that. Quick with the fingers on that one, but it is May 18th that Kira and her colleagues will be presenting in more detail their scenario and the work that they're doing. Thank you, Kira. And you should be on the lookout for more information on that. And I can't thank you all enough for spending your morning with us. We really appreciate the time, and we look forward to seeing you again next month.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Have a great day, everyone.